Hello, I'm Dr. Townsend. Welcome to my video. Since 1975, I've met with thousands of people in counseling and social work settings. Many of these people are folks who've come seeking help to cope better with their emotions and to handle communication better in relationships with people. For many of the people who I've met with, it's been helpful to start with a basic analysis of a relationship between two things. These are emotion and behavior. Now, emotion, of course, is the feelings that a person has on the inside. Emotions are the feelings inside one's body, inside one's mind. Other people can't be aware of a person's emotions unless a person somehow shows those emotions. Now, behavior is, of course, the actions that we do with our body to interact with the rest of the world. Emotion might be considered an internal state. It's what's going on the inside of the body and the mind. Behavior is more an external state. It's what we do to interact with the world outside of ourselves. Most folks look at the relationship between emotion and behavior in a very good, solid, common sense, workable manner. It goes something like this. Some sort of an event occurs in the environment and a person perceives it. Based on the perceptions of what is going on in the environment, a person has an emotional reaction. Whether it's something that's occurred at home or at work or at school, at the store, driving down the street, we see things, we perceive things going on around us. We have emotional reactions to the things that we perceive going on around us. Based on the emotional reaction to what we see going on around us, some sort of behavior inevitably follows. For example, if there was something going on in the environment to which a person has a positive emotional reaction, such as happiness or pleasure, the behavior that follows the emotion is typically something intended to keep the good thing in the environment going so that the good emotions can reoccur or continue. If what has occurred in the environment, what we perceive in the environment, is something to which a person has a negative emotional reaction, unhappiness, pain, frustration, things such as that, then typically the behavior that follows is a behavior that's intended to get that unpleasant thing in the environment to stop, to go away, so that we don't keep re-experiencing the negative emotional reaction. The behavior that follows emotions is not determined really by what's going on in the environment. The behavior that a person uses is determined by a person's emotional reaction to what's going on in the environment. One person who, for example, likes chocolate pudding, if you were to hand that person chocolate pudding, that person would say thank you and would eat it. Another person who doesn't happen to like chocolate pudding, if you gave that person chocolate pudding, they'd be likely to gently push it away and say, no thank you, may I have something else? It's not the chocolate pudding itself that causes a person to either push it away or to eat it. Rather, it's a person's emotional feelings about what they see in front of them. Of course, chocolate pudding is just one small example of a bigger picture, but the basic idea is there. If a person likes what they see, then the behavior that follows is determined by the fact that they like what's going on. If a person does not like what's going on in the environment, then the behavior is going to be completely different. One event in the environment, one person might have a positive emotional reaction, and their behaviors are going to seek to continue that thing in the environment. A second person perceiving the exact same thing in the environment might not like what they see, and their behaviors that follow will be completely different. The events in the environment are not the determining factors of behaviors. Rather, the determining factor of behavior is the emotional reaction to what's going on in the environment. That's a very good, workable, common sense way of looking at the relationship between emotion and environment. It's got some depth, it's got some meaning, it's easy to understand. It's the way that most people tend to look at the relationship between emotion and behavior. There is a deeper level to the relationship between emotion and behavior. Now, this deeper level is something that I think that most people already know, but they don't think about very much. It's just like people don't think about the good, typical common sense relationship. People don't think about it very much. People just follow that model. They just use it as the idea is just sort of a given. People don't think about it very much, but they know that it seems to be true. At a deeper level, there are other things going on with the relationship between emotion and behavior. Now, these deeper things, I believe most people know these deeper things as well, but they don't think about them very much. At a deeper level, it works something like this. A person has got some sort of emotion, whether it's in reaction to something in the environment or wherever it comes from. A person has got some sort of emotion going on. Now, just like in the common sense model up here, where emotion determines behavior, well, here at a deeper level, that same thing holds true. Wherever there is emotion, there's going to be some sort of behavior to follow it. Now, when we're talking about the good common sense way of looking at the relationship between emotion and behavior, we were talking about events in the environment seem to spur the emotions. A person perceives something going on and they have an emotional reaction to it. Here at the deeper level, we have a situation that no matter where the emotion came from, there's going to be some sort of behavior. Now, up here, we looked at a person perceiving things going on in the environment, but at a deeper level, we have a situation where there is a part of the brain, sits right around here, right behind a little area that's called the fissure of Rolando, a cute name. This part of the brain that I'm talking about is primarily connected to the nerves in the muscles, so that the brain can be aware of the actions of the muscles. Now, this part of the brain is connected primarily only to the muscles, and all it really knows directly is what's going on with the actions of the muscles. It's not connected directly to the eyes or the ears. It doesn't know actually what's going on in the environment except by interpreting the behaviors that the person is using. So here at a deeper level, rather than emotions being pulled forward simply by things that are going on in the environment, at the deeper level, emotions are pulled forward by the awareness of the behaviors that a person is using. The perception of one's own behaviors, now oftentimes it's a subconscious process, it's a very automatic process, but people are aware of their own behaviors. The behavior itself, the awareness of the behavior itself, leads to some sort of emotion. Now, as up here in the good common sense model, again, emotion is followed by behavior. That's the way human beings tend to work. Our emotions are followed by some sort of behavior. So down here at the deeper level again, we have some sort of emotion going on. Maybe it's been brought on by awareness of behavior, but there's some sort of emotion going on, and as there is an emotion, there is going to follow some sort of behavior. Now, as that part of the brain that's connected to the muscles to be aware of the actions of the muscles, as that part of the brain perceives this new set of behaviors that are going on, the perception of those behaviors itself is going to lead to some sort of an emotion. In the common sense model, we have a situation that's called a linear relationship. Some sort of event occurs in the environment. The actual relationship between emotion and behavior, though, is that an emotion occurs, a behavior follows the emotion, the behavior deals with the environment, case closed, until something new comes up in the environment. It's a linear model. It's closed-ended. You have an emotion, you have a behavior, case closed, until something new external to a person changes. At this deeper level, it's not a linear, closed-ended situation. What we have is a cycle going on inside a person, going on inside each and every person, a cycle going from emotion to behavior, constantly, round and round, 24 hours a day. This cycle even occurs when we're asleep at night. Some common examples of this cycle, common examples that people have come to my office seeking some help with, are people come to me saying, Dr. Townsend, when I feel angry, I find myself doing or saying mean things. Or people come to me commonly also saying, Dr. Townsend, when I feel sad, I find myself withdraw from people, avoiding people, avoiding contact. Now, some people, when they get angry, they say or do mean things. Some people, when they're sad, they become withdrawn and avoidant. Some people, of course, when they're angry, they become withdrawn. Some people, when they're sad, they start to say and do mean things. So I put both of these emotions here side by side, as they often apply to each other. Now, if a person has got a habit of using mean or withdrawn behavior in reaction to the emotions of anger or sadness, triggers the behaviors. As the brain becomes aware of the behaviors, particularly with these types of behaviors, mean behaviors or withdrawn behaviors, as the brain perceives those behaviors, not knowing what's going on in the environment, but just knowing what the behaviors are, behaviors themselves will typically lead to an increase of anger or sadness. Now, of course, as the sense of anger and sadness increases, the behaviors increase. Person becomes more mean or withdrawn. As the brain perceives the increase of mean and withdrawn behaviors, it affects how the person feels. And you generally will see an increase of the emotions of anger and sadness. Now, as anger and sadness increase, the behaviors increase. So you see an increase of the mean and withdrawn behaviors. And as that increases, the emotion increases. As the emotion increases, the behavior increases. And so on, round and round, to where it's no longer a nice, tight, neat little cycle. But what you've got is what I like to use an analogy for as a snowball. It grows on itself. It feeds on itself. It gets bigger and bigger the longer it continues going. Now, all of this is going on just inside one person. Let's imagine this little snowball diagram being drawn off to the side to represent a second person. Now, if this person is, say, living in Albuquerque, and this second person is living in, say, Nebraska, and has no contact, nothing to do with this person down in Albuquerque, well, this person in Nebraska, having their emotional snowball, is going to have an emotional behavioral snowball completely separate from the person here in Albuquerque. The two snowballs have nothing to do with each other. Both of the snowballs occur, but they're completely separate. Just two snowballs going on. They may be getting bigger and bigger, but they're completely separate from each other. Now, if we were to imagine this person who lives in Nebraska getting in their car and driving down the highway, coming down through, well, what would that be, Oklahoma, Texas, and coming down the highway down through New Mexico, coming down through the mountains and into Albuquerque, and moving into this person's home in Albuquerque. We've got two people in the same room at the same time with each other. So let's imagine this person from Nebraska, their emotional snowball diagram. Let's bring that into Albuquerque, into the house of this other person. In which case, we're going to take the person from Nebraska, we're going to take their snowball diagram and draw it as overlapping with this other person's diagram. It's no longer two separate snowballs, but rather it is two snowballs that overlap with each other and interact with each other. When there are two emotional behavioral snowballs going on together at the same time in the same house, it's different than just two separate emotional behavioral snowballs. It takes on a different meaning. It's not just one snowball plus one snowball, but rather the two snowballs multiply and feed off of each other. And to continue the analogy, it's more than just two snowballs at this point. It becomes an avalanche. It's a mass crashing down the mountainside, knocking the trees and the rocks out of the way, taking no heed for how a person feels, how another person feels, not even taking heed for how one feels inside oneself, really, but just simply wanting to express these emotions through these behaviors, has blinders, crashing down the hill, taking no heed of anything other than expressing these emotions with these habitual sorts of behaviors. Now, these sorts of behaviors, such as being mean or withdrawn in reaction to emotions such as anger or sadness, these behaviors are learned habitual behaviors. You'll typically find a person over their lifetime will react to the same emotions with the same general sorts of behavior time and time again. It occurs and occurs and occurs over and over and over. It's a habitual behavioral response to a given set of emotions. Now, the habits that a person might have that they use in reaction to their emotions, the habits are learned behaviors. The emotions are basically normal, natural things. Everyone is born to have emotions. There's no way to stop it. No one would want to stop emotions. Life would be meaningless without the emotions. Emotions are normal, natural things. Emotions themselves are not really a problem. The behaviors that a person learns to use in reaction to their emotions, that's typically where the difficulty comes in. The behaviors that a person uses to cope with their emotions. So the emotions are a normal, natural process. And in the counseling office, I never try to get people to stop having emotions. Everyone needs to have their emotions. It's a normal, natural thing. The behaviors have to be learned somewhere. We learn our behavioral reactions to our emotions. Now, these learned reactions typically come from one of 2 or 3 places. One of the most common places where people learn their the behavioral reactions to their emotions, one of the most common places that people learn those behaviors is in their home, in childhood. When we're children and we observe our parents reacting to their emotions, reacting to situations in certain ways, as children, particularly when we're very young, we look up to our parents as virtual gods. They know everything. They know how to handle everything. They know what to do. So as children, we learn to copy our parents. Whether we intend to or not, it seems to be just a normal process of learning. When people are young children, they learn to react in similar manners as their parents do, just as a normal process of human development. I find that folks who come to my office for help with things like anger, when they're angry they yell. Typically you'll find that these same folks, when they were young, came from households where the parents were yellers. Or folks who come to me for help with being withdrawn when they're sad, they typically come from households where the adults in the household would become withdrawn and avoidant in situations where they felt sad. We learn our behaviors from our parents. Our emotions just come from nature. We're born to have the emotions. The behaviors that we use in reaction to the emotions are learned. In the household, growing up is the most common place that people learn their behaviors. There are a couple of other places where people learn behavioral reactions to their emotions. One of the other common sources of learning for behavioral reactions is among adults. When an adult marries or moves in with, to reside with another adult, they role model for each other. They teach each other behavioral reactions to emotions. I found that typically, if there's a person who comes from a loud household from childhood, a household of yellers, let's say, a household of people who get mean when they're upset, when that person becomes an adult and then they marry in or live with someone who came from a calmer household as a child, typically what you'll find is the person who came from the meaner household, as it were, typically doesn't change their behaviors over time very much in reaction to the calmer person. Rather, what tends to happen is that the calmer person over time becomes more aggressive to match the person who came from the meaner household in childhood. This seems to happen for a couple of reasons. One reason, when you've got one person in a household who tends to have aggressive behaviors, you have another person who was raised to have calmer behaviors. The person who was raised to be calmer oftentimes feels over time that they need to start defending themselves against the more aggressive person. So they will start to behave more aggressively in order to protect themselves physically or emotionally from the more aggressive person. Another thing that oftentimes happens is that when there's one person who is fairly aggressive in a household, another person was raised to be calm, the calmer person will often become more aggressive over time in order to try to fit in with the more aggressive person. More aggressive spouses tend to belittle or insult the calmer spouse, saying, "You don't show your feelings. You don't let anything out. What's wrong with you? Why are you always holding things inside?" Becoming insulting to the calmer person simply because they're not aggressive. So in order to try to fit in with the more aggressive person, the person who was raised to be calmer becomes more aggressive to fit in. Calmer spouses tend to become more aggressive also because as children raised in a calm household, they were not taught, they were not trained, they were not shown how to deal with aggressive people. So they become, in a marriage or in a relationship where they live with someone, they become more aggressive because they don't know how else to handle it. They see this aggressive person handling things aggressively in order to defend themselves and fit in and just find a way to handle the aggressive feelings in the household. The calmer person will generally tend to become more aggressive as time goes by. Another place that I've seen where many people learn aggressive behaviors, although they might have been raised in a nice, calm, quiet household, people who handle their emotions in a good, constructive manner, they were raised in that kind of household, but they come to me as an adult saying, "Dr. Townsend, I find myself, when I'm upset, I found myself acting like a jerk, and I don't understand why." Well, one place that people learn those behaviors is perhaps in a marriage relationship, but that's not always where calm or people learn to be aggressive. Sometimes it's from the work environment. I've had several folks come to see me who were police officers, firemen, jail guards, prison guards, people who work in environments where aggressiveness is condoned and role modeled by co-workers. Now, perhaps it's not condoned and demanded by the work policies of an agency where someone works, but rather environments that require some aggression at some times tend to bring together people who are comfortable with aggression. And when a person who is raised to be calm starts to work in an environment such as that, their level of aggressive behavior tends to go up and up and up so that they can fit in with their co-workers, so that they can perhaps effectively get the job done because the job requires aggression at some times. The home, whether the childhood home or the adult marriage home, the home is not always the place where people learn aggressive responses to emotions, but sometimes it comes from the work environment. Some work environments are what one might call toxic. They will change a person's personality for the worse. And folks who work in toxic environments oftentimes come to me complaining that the aggressive reactions that they learned at work have been generalizing over into the home environment. So when they come home from their toxic workplace, they behave in a toxic manner toward their household members. A person who was raised in a calm household and lives in a calm household but gets a job in an aggressive environment, that person will very often start to become more aggressive at home. Regardless of whether aggressive or withdrawn behaviors are learned in childhood or in an adult home or in the workplace or from a school environment or from peers, regardless of where those behaviors are learned, the fact remains that those are learned behaviors. For some people, the habitual use of those learned behaviors becomes so ingrained that they identify the behavior with the emotion, and perhaps they were taught as children or in other places they were taught to identify the behavior with the emotion to where they see the behavior and the emotion as one and the same. You'll hear people refer to some behaviors as being angry behaviors. A person might behave in an angry manner, is a common phrase. However, behaviors themselves are not angry or happy behaviors. Anger, happiness, sadness, joy, frustration, those are all emotions. They are not behaviors, although people who have habitual behaviors that they use in response to those emotions tend to feel that the emotion and the behavior are one and the same. Actually, they are quite separate. Emotions are the things we feel on the inside. Behaviors are the things we do with our body to interact with the rest of the world. They're quite different. Emotion and behavior simply are not one and the same. People learn specific behaviors to use in reaction to specific emotions. So whether the behaviors were learned in childhood, in marriage, in work, in school, from friends, wherever it's learned from, it still remains that it's a learned behavior. The awareness that behavioral reactions to emotions is learned, and looking inside oneself and at one's past, being aware that one learned behaviors from some specific place can be a very useful insight, just simply to know where the behaviors came from that a person is unhappy with, such as if a person is yelling or throwing things or hiding away from people. There's some value in knowing where those behaviors came from. The main value in knowing where the behaviors came from is simply to help differentiate behavior from emotion. If a person knows where they learned behaviors, they can look at the environment that they learned it from and see that was a teaching environment for the behavior. Being aware that other people in different sorts of environments don't use the same behaviors. Although everybody has the same sorts of emotions, not everybody uses the same sorts of behaviors. Not everybody becomes aggressive when they're angry. Not everybody becomes withdrawn when they're sad, and so on. The behaviors are learned, and it's helpful to look inside oneself, to look at one's past, and see where one learned the behavioral reactions that person uses on a habitual basis. However, being aware of where behaviors came from, being aware of where behaviors were learned from, does not necessarily get those behaviors to change. Knowing where a person learned how to cope with emotions does not give a person skills to cope with emotions better. It doesn't give a person new things to try, new things to develop as more constructive habits. I suppose that's one of the flaws that you might find in some psychological theorists, such as Sigmund Freud, who basically thought if you can help a person to achieve insight and awareness to where a behavior came from, the behavior is likely to stop. In my experience, that's not true. Once a person knows where their behavior came from, they just simply blame the past on their behavior. They simply blame their behavior on the past, and the behavior continues, and they justify it or explain it away by simply saying it came from the past, sort of taking it out of the person's hands so they don't feel like there's any purpose or need to change it because it's not their fault. Simple awareness of where a person learned a behavior can be useful, but it does not solve the problem of finding better ways to cope with emotions. When people feel that the behavior and the emotion are one and the same because of habitual use of the behavior? Well, it's sort of like this. We're going to use another analogy. We're using snowballs and avalanches a few minutes ago. I'm going to use a somewhat different analogy at this point. I'm going to use an analogy based on restaurants. Now, we could use an Italian restaurant or a Chinese restaurant or an American food restaurant. We could use any sort of restaurant, but I just have to pick one so I can use it in a sensible way. Just randomly, I'm going to pick Chinese restaurant. We're going to imagine a pretend Chinese restaurant, just an imaginary Chinese restaurant. Now, the analogy works like this. A person feels hungry, so they go to a restaurant seeking food. This is an analogy for a person who feels angry and they need to do something with their anger. They seek a behavior to use to follow the emotion of anger. The analogy is that a person going to the restaurant feels hungry. They're seeking a behavior to use in reaction to their hunger. They want to eat. They go into a restaurant. Now, let's suppose a person goes into our imaginary Chinese restaurant and the waiter were to come out and hand you a menu. And there at the top of the menu is written the word rice. And rice is the only word on the menu. The rest of it is blank. Just the word rice. And the waiter says, "You're hungry? You eat rice. Rice is all we have. When a person is hungry, they eat rice. Rice and hunger, they go together. There is no choice. You feel hungry, you must eat rice." That's an analogy for a person who, when they feel angry, believes that they must behave in an aggressive manner. Anger and aggression go together, and there is no choice. Once a person is angry, it is the same as behaving aggressive. It's like a person who goes into the restaurant and is told the only thing they can eat when they're hungry is rice. Now, this of course is an imaginary restaurant that I just told you about. If one were to walk into a real restaurant, a real Chinese restaurant, of course you go into that restaurant and the waiter is going to hand you a menu and it's going to have listed dozens, perhaps scores of different food items on there. Many, many things that one could choose from. Even in a real Chinese restaurant, rice is on there. Rice can be chosen, but it's not the only choice. When a person feels angry, aggression is there. Aggression is on the menu, but it's not the only choice available on the menu. So I'm going to show you today a menu of behaviors that are available, the behaviors that are available on the menu of life. Now there are millions of behaviors available, of course. There are too many behaviors available for us to cover in a really meaningful way in this video, and to try to cover every possible behavior on the menu of life would go so long that frankly you would get bored to death, and so would I. So what would be the point in that? So I'm going to take the millions of available behaviors on the menu of life, and I'm going to shrink them down into 4 simple categories. 4 categories is very easy to understand and think about as compared to millions. So we're going to take all the behaviors available on the menu of life and shrink it down into 4 simple categories. One category of behavior available on the menu of life is rice, the aggressive behaviors. Another category that's available on the menu of life is called passive behavior. Another category available on the menu of life combines these two together, combines passive and aggressive together to make a third category that's called the passive-aggressive category. Passive-aggressive. I'm going to have to move this one up a little bit so I've got enough room to write. There we go. 3 categories of behavior available on the menu of life. Aggressive behaviors, passive behaviors, and passive-aggressive behaviors. I'm going to divide these up into separate categories. Now, the aggressive behaviors, my experience is that the easiest way to help folks understand what the aggressive class of behaviors are, the best way to show that is just to put down some examples. If you were here in my office today, I would ask you to give me examples, and I would write your examples down. But hey, you're not here, so I'm going to write down some examples. Some common examples of aggressive behaviors, things that people have identified here at my office. They've identified these behaviors as aggressive. There are things such as yelling, hitting, throwing things, people don't only throw things. I worked at a psychiatric hospital for 10 years in my younger days. There were a few occasions in which I would run across rather large and mean patients in the psychiatric hospital, and there were some occasions where folks would pick me up. My nickname used to be Skinny. They would pick me up and literally hurl me. People not only throw things, but sometimes people throw other people. To continue the list, some additional examples of aggressive behaviors include insults, calling people stupid, saying they don't know what they're doing, insulting remarks like that. Name calling, very much like the insults, oftentimes perhaps the same as insults. We've got yelling, hitting, throwing things, insults, name calling. Some other examples of aggressive behaviors might include something that a lot of people don't really think of as being aggressive, but it certainly is. It is sarcasm. Sarcasm is a hidden form of insult. Sarcasm is typically using normal, positive, constructive words, but using a tone of voice that completely changes the meaning of those words. For example, let's pretend that someone was sitting here next to me, and if I was to come into the room and tell that person, "Hi, how are you? It's good to see you. I'm glad you're here today." That's very clear, straightforward. The person knows just what I mean. But if I was to come in and use a different tone of voice, a sarcastic tone, with the same exact words, you'd see something like this. "Well, hi, how are you? I'm glad you're here today." Taking the exact same words, turning them around, and making them into an insult. Some folks will carry the hidden form of insult, the sarcasm, they'll carry it so far that if this person was If I was to say to this person, well, hi, it's good to see you. I'm glad you're here today. If they were to respond, they were just respond to me by saying, why are you saying those mean things to me? Well, some people will carry it so far that they'll say, I wasn't saying anything mean. I was just saying, hi, how are you? Why are you so upset? Why are you so upset? Why are you so sensitive? They'll insult a person when the person sees that the sarcasm is an insult. Sarcasm is a hidden form of insult. Another form of aggressive behavior that people sometimes use is the threat. A threat, of course, is when you tell somebody what you want them to do, and then you tell them what bad thing you're going to do to them if they don't comply. That's a threat. You say what you want, and then you threaten to do something bad for non-compliance. Another common form of aggressive behavior that people use is a demand. Just like sarcasm was a hidden form of insult, the demand is a hidden form of threat. Whereas in a threat, a person openly says what harm they are going to do in case of non-compliance. Demand is more that a person says what they want somebody to do, and they don't say the bad thing they're going to do if that person doesn't comply. They just leave it implied. If a person doesn't comply, then they just get the negative consequence, although they haven't been warned in advance. A demand is a statement of what you want a person to do, and you don't tell them the harm you're going to do for non-compliance, but you're intending to do harm. A threat is an overt stating of what harm would be done. A demand is just simply saying what you want a person to do and not stating the threat openly, but following a threat, a non-verbal threat, following that through in case of non-compliance. Passive behaviors. Passive behaviors are a little bit trickier to understand. Rather than just writing out a few examples, as we could do up here, this is very easy to do up here, rather than just writing out a few examples, passive behavior is a little bit more complicated to understand, so I'm going to write out basically a definition, and then I'll tell you a couple of examples that might fit that definition. Passive behavior is when a person does nothing, or a person intentionally chooses to do nothing. They choose to be inactive. They choose inaction. Although inaction causes a risk of harm. A risk of harm. Passive behavior is when a person intentionally chooses to do nothing, although by doing nothing, they create some sort of risk of harm. The harm that comes from passive behavior could be harm to oneself, or it could be harm to someone else. Passive behaviors, the harm that could come to oneself through passive behaviors, are that if a person always holds their feelings inside, if they never actively talk about their feelings, they never let their feelings out, but they're always holding their feelings inside in a passive manner, they run the risk of making themselves nervous and anxious because they feel like nobody wants to listen. They always hold things inside. It snowballs on itself. person becomes nervous and anxious on the inside. If a person maintains an anxious state long enough, that anxiety can turn into depression, where a person feels helpless and hopeless. Anxiety and depression can come from passively holding feelings inside. Holding feelings inside all the time, never expressing them, can cause things like ulcers, high blood pressure. High blood pressure can lead to things like stroke and death. Passive behavior can be very harmful. It can cause physical illness, emotional problems. In extreme cases, it could cause death. Now, of course, the emotional problems and the physical illness are very common results of passively holding feelings inside. The risks of harm from passive behavior that could come to other people, as opposed to the harm that could be caused to oneself. Passive behavior can cause harm to other people too. A simple example of that, imagine yourself walking down the street, walking down the sidewalk rather. Now on this side of the sidewalk is a street with a few cars passing up and down once in a while. Not a very busy street, but some traffic on it. On the other side of the street, of the sidewalk rather, is a house with a yard. Now, in that yard, there's a 3-year-old girl playing with her ball. She's 3 years old. Of course she is. Sooner or later, she's going to drop that ball. It comes rolling down the yard, comes rolling across the sidewalk, goes rolling out into the street. Now, this little girl is 3 years old. She wants her ball. She goes after the ball. She comes running down her yard. She comes walking out across the street, across the sidewalk. She goes out into the street. Now, if you do nothing to stop her from crossing the sidewalk and going into the street, well, maybe she's going to just walk into the street and get her ball. Maybe she's not going to get hit by a car. There's not constant traffic. Maybe she's just going to walk out there and get her ball. No harm done. If she does walk into the street to get her ball, and a car comes along and hits her, well, it's not like you physically picked her up and threw her in front of the moving car in order to intentionally cause her to be hit by that car. No, if she comes down her yard, across the sidewalk into the street, and she gets hit by a car, it's not that you intentionally cause her to get hurt, but by not stopping her from going into the street, by not saying, little girl, stop, or by whatever means, stopping her from going into the street, and she gets hit by a car, you've passively, by not taking any action to stop her, you've passively created a risk that some harm might come to her. So the harm that comes from passive behavior could be harm to oneself. It could be a risk of harm to other people. The passive-aggressive category of behavior is again a fairly complicated form of behavior. So I'm not going to just write down some examples. Again, I'm going to put a definition and tell some examples that tend to fit the definition. Now, the term passive-aggressive, this is a term that everybody's heard of and most people use from time to time, but most people are not terribly clear on what it means. I'm going to give a definition for it here. Passive-aggressive behavior combines the passive and the aggressive. The passive end of passive-aggressive behavior is the part about do nothing, intentionally do nothing, intentional inaction. Do nothing, inaction. The aggressive part of passive-aggressive behavior is that when a person intentionally chooses to do nothing, they're choosing to do nothing because they want to intentionally cause harm. The most common sort of harm that people seek to cause with passive-aggressive behavior is emotional harm. For example, suppose that I was having an argument with my wife, and if my wife was to tell me, you know, Robert, this argument really isn't getting us anywhere. We're just not going anywhere with this. How about if we relax for a little while, and talk about this later. I'll tell you what. Why don't you come with me into the kitchen, and we'll do the dishes together. That'll take our mind off of this argument for a little while. We can calm down, and then we can come back and we can talk about this later when we're calmer. If I was to tell her, no, I sit myself down on the couch and I say, no, I'm not doing anything for you because I'm angry at you. I'm not doing anything for you. I would be behaving in a passive-aggressive manner. I know that she has got a good idea. I know she's trying to be helpful, but I'm angry at her, so I want to hurt her feelings, and I refuse to cooperate with her. I intentionally choose to do nothing. I choose inaction to intentionally cause her some emotional harm. I want to hurt her feelings because I'm angry at her. That's a passive-aggressive sort of behavior. So we've got three categories. We've got the aggressive, we've got the passive, and we've got the passive-aggressive. Now, in my practice at counseling, of course, people don't come here to learn bad ways to do things. People come here to learn good ways to do things, and perhaps to find the difference between bad ways and good ways so that they can pursue the good more often. There is one thing that all of these three behaviors have in common. It's this: the idea of somehow causing harm. Now up here we don't have the word harm written in, but of course these types of behaviors are clearly intended to either cause physical or emotional harm to someone. Harm is somehow involved in aggressive behaviors. Now, when I give consideration to the difference between bad ways to handle things and good ways to handle things, I know I've got to somehow have a definition for good and for bad. When I try to think of a definition for bad ways to handle things, well, this word, harm, invariably comes to mind. Things that cause harm are inherently bad. Coming up with a definition for bad is not very hard. You look for things that are harmful, you got a definition for bad ways to handle things. Coming up with a definition of the good can be considerably more complicated. Some people, in order to find what the good is, some people might turn to religion or philosophy or law. There are many different very good places that a person could turn to look for a definition of the good. And all of those places are very good, and you'll find very meaningful definitions in religion and philosophy and law. You'll find good, meaningful definitions for the good. However, the definitions that you might arrive at from religion, philosophy, and law, those definitions, they tend to be very, very detailed, very long, very complicated. Trust me, I know this is true. One of my 4 college degrees is a philosophy degree. And as you can see from my rack of books over here, I could talk to you, I could talk with you about how to define the good for the next 2.5 years. We could do that. I've got a degree in philosophy. I could carry on and on and on about various ways to define the good. However, you would get bored to death, and so would I. So let's seek a simpler way to define the good. Works basically like this. Good is the opposite of bad. Now we've defined the bad, so having defined the bad, if we find the opposite of bad, by simply finding the opposite of bad, we're going to hit, by definition, on good. It's much easier than years of training in philosophy and religion, just simply seeking the opposite of bad in order to find good. This fourth category of behavior, I'll bet you notice I left a blank spot here. This fourth category of behavior is called, let's find a good color here. Let's try blue. This fourth category of behavior is called assertive behavior. Now, to find the good, seeking opposite of bad, well, one thing that's very important in assertive behavior is calm. To be calm is very important in seeking good ways to handle things. Calm being the opposite of things such as yelling, hitting, the opposite of throwing things. Those are not calm behaviors. Calm behavior is the opposite of that, using a normal conversational tone of voice, using quiet body language, not flailing around, not throwing things, not getting loud, but just having normal conversation, as we're doing right now. This is calm behavior. Calm behavior is very important to seeking good ways to handle things. Calm behavior is very important, but is not sufficient. For example, let's again pretend that someone was sitting over here, and I'm going to be very, very calm toward that person sitting over here. You know what? God darn jerk, I think that you're the biggest ass that I've met in my life. That was very calm, but highly aggressive. Being calm, while being critical to good ways to handle things, is not sufficient, is not in and of itself enough to get good ways to handle things. Being calm is critical, but not the whole picture. Another important piece in finding good ways to handle things is the idea of being polite. Now, polite is, of course, the opposite of things such as insults, the opposite of name-calling, the opposite of sarcasm, and the opposite of threats, things such as that. Being polite is the opposite of those. So in seeking definitions by opposites, we've got calm and polite as being the opposite of the aggressive behaviors. Now, a person could, in a very calm and polite manner, sit back and watch the world fall apart and do nothing about it. While staying calm and polite, a person can be very passive. So, we need an opposite to the passive behavior. Very simple. It works something like this. Instead of holding all of your feelings inside all of the time, such as passive people do, not talking about how they feel, not doing anything to change situations, that's what passive behavior is. The opposite of passive behavior is simply say what you feel. To say what you feel instead of holding things inside. That gives us an opposite to these passive behaviors. Saying what you feel as the opposite of holding things inside. Very important step toward finding good ways to handle things. Now, of course, a person could very calmly and politely state how they feel, and then without giving anyone else a chance to respond, get up and leave the room. Thereby, calmly and politely saying what they feel in a passive-aggressive manner. Not allowing other people to say how they feel, refusing to allow other people to talk, refusing to participate in conversation. That's the do nothing. The inactive part is not participating in conversation with people. Passive-aggressive behavior can be just saying what you think and then walk away. That's passive-aggressive. Knowing the other person is going to feel hurt, that you don't care how they feel or you don't want to listen to them, it's going to hurt their feelings. They will feel insulted. Passive-aggressive behavior. We need an opposite to that, an opposite to not listening to other people. The opposite to that would, of course, be use good listening skills. Use good listening skills. After saying how you feel in a calm, polite manner, use good listening skills to encourage other people to say how they feel too. Even if you don't like how they feel, and if you don't like what they have to say, if you shut them out and not allow them to express themselves, then you're being passive-aggressive, and that is a harmful, a bad way to handle things. We're not seeking harm today, we're seeking the good. The opposite to passive-aggressive behavior is to use good listening skills. Show that you have some concern for how other people feel. Show that you're going to listen and encourage other people to talk, even if you don't like what they have to say. They might have just listened to you, even though they didn't like what you had to say. Well, give them a chance to speak too. But this really isn't a matter of trying to get a balance of how they treat you and how you treat them. No, this is just a matter of using good coping skills, good communication and relationship skills. Even if the other person doesn't seem very prone to listen to you, if you don't listen to them, you're going to be passive-aggressive just like they're being to you. Two people being passive-aggressive doesn't make it right, it just makes it a bad habit. It makes it a avalanche of passive-aggressive that goes on and on forever, unless somebody breaks the cycle and starts to show interest in listening to each other. Calmly and politely say what you feel, then use good listening skills. Very simple. Now, in a little while, in this video, in a few minutes, I'm going to show you a couple of very easy to use types of good listening skills, very concrete tools that can be used to help cope well and communicate well. There's one other type of assertive behavior that I'm going to put in. There's only 5 types of behavior that go into this category. Only 5. Very easy to remember. The 5th, and perhaps the most important, particularly in adult relationships, is the use of requests. The use of requests is the opposite of demands. The difference between a request and a demand Well, some people have a hard time understanding the difference between a request and a demand. When I'm doing this training with folks here at my office, I typically ask them to tell me what they see as being the difference between a request and a demand. And most people will say, well, a request is a question. You say it nicely. And a demand is where you're telling somebody what to do, and perhaps you're being terse about it. They say that the difference between a request and a demand is how you say what you want. How you say what you want is the difference between a request and a demand. That is an error. That is not the actual difference between a request and a demand. The difference between a request and a demand, and the only real difference between a request and a demand, is whether you're willing to accept no as an answer. Let's suppose that my wife was sitting in this chair and I was to ask my wife, honey, dear, you know you're the love of my life. I'll always love you. Will you please come and help me with the dishes? And if she was to say to me, no, I'm busy right now, I can't help you. And then I respond to her by saying, well, darn it, what is wrong with you? You never help me with anything. What's wrong with our relationship? We don't get any cooperation around here. Well, I had started off, honey, love of my life, you know I'll love you forever. Will you please come help me with the dishes? Sounded like a very nice, respectful request. But then, when my wife said no, I became aggressive. That is the definition of demand. When you ask for something and you don't tell somebody the bad that you're going to do for noncompliance, when they say no, you get mean to them, that's what a demand is. A request, on the other hand, a request is when you ask a person to do something, and if they say no, you accept no as the answer. That is the only difference between a request and a demand. A request, you accept no as an answer. A demand, somehow become hostile or try to punish the person when they say no when you ask them to do something. The use of requests instead of demands is critical to good relationships with people, particularly in marriages or boyfriends and girlfriends or just among friends and peers. The use of requests instead of demands is very important. People who are social equals to each other do not have the right to make demands on each other. And if a person is demanding toward another person, then the other person is going to resent it, and those resentments will build up over time and affect their relationship, affect the communication, affect the coping skills of the people in the relationship. That is the sort of emotional harm that comes from demanding behaviors. To use requests instead of demands is very, very important. Now, using requests instead of demands certainly has its apparent drawbacks, but those drawbacks are necessary to good relationships. When one makes a request instead of a demand, that means that when you ask somebody to do something, they might not do it. They might say no. And if you're using a request instead of a demand, using a request, if somebody else says, if they say no to what you ask them to do, that means that some things will go undone because you're not going to try to force them in a demanding way. Request means that you accept no as an answer instead of trying to force somebody to do something. Using request means that sometimes things will not get done because you'll ask somebody to do something and they'll say no. Using request instead of demands sometimes means that you yourself are going to end up doing certain things that you wish somebody else would do. Those are apparent drawbacks, but the only other alternative to request is the demand. If you're not using requests, then you're going to be using aggressive behaviors, and it's not going to go well for the relationship. Now, the connection between requests and demands, of course, is different if you're dealing with people who are social equals to each other, such as spouses, friends, peers, as compared to if you're dealing with people who are not social equals, such as a parent dealing with a child, or a boss in a workplace dealing with an employee. Those are different situations. Parents dealing with children sometimes need to make demands. Parents are more mature, they have more experience, better judgment. It's part of their job as a parent to guide the children, and that means sometimes telling the children what to do when the children don't understand why you want them to do that. Sometimes even when you explain to a child why do you want them to do something, they don't understand because they don't have the maturity and the judgment and the life experience to understand. So sometimes a parent simply has to make demands on a child. It's ethically, morally, oftentimes legally necessary for parents to make demands. Now, of course, if a parent makes demands, which all parents must from time to time, if a parent makes demands, a parent doesn't want to then, if the child says no, a parent doesn't want to slip into things like yelling and hitting and throwing and so forth. There are good assertive ways to back up a demand that one makes on a child. Usually just regular conversation to help a child understand what you want is sufficient. If you've got a child who stubbornly just simply digs their heels in and refuses to cooperate with what you as a parent ask them to do, if you've got a child who is that stubborn and is persistently that stubborn and it really gets on your nerves and you find yourself yelling or hitting or throwing things like that, there are some alternatives to aggressive behavior. Some of the alternatives come in the form of behavior contracts where you spell out what the expectations are and what the consequences would be, and oftentimes good non-aggressive consequences to apply if a child stubbornly refuses. Good non-aggressive alternatives are things like withholding privileges as a consequence, and keeping that consequence to a reasonable period of time so it doesn't become aggressively mean. If you have particular difficulties in that regard, you might want to try talking with a specialist on family relationships for some hints. If you'd like, the video that you're watching now is one video in a series of videos. There are other videos in this series, series called Dr. Townsend, Welcome to My Video. There are other volumes in the series that deal with behavior contracts, and you might like to check those out. Be that as it may, parents must at times make demands onto children. But between equals, requests is the only good way to go. In workplaces, bosses must at times make demands on the employees because the boss oftentimes knows the work situation better than the employee. Sometimes the boss doesn't even have time to explain to the employee why the boss wants what the boss wants. The boss has to simply say, do it now. We don't have time to explain. Of course, sometimes that occurs between a parent and a child as well. The basic focus of today's video is dealing with relationships between adults. Using requests instead of demands. Again, has its drawbacks. Some things might not get done. You might end up doing things yourself. But the only other alternative is to become somehow aggressive. It builds up resentments and degrades the relationship over time. If you make demands onto your boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse, even if the person doesn't express their resentment back, if they passively hold those feelings inside, you run the risk in the relationship that a long-term risk of harm, passive sorts of risk of harm, might arise. Another risk of passive behavior that we didn't discuss earlier, very easy to understand risk, is that if a person holds their feelings inside too long and negative feelings build up too much, you run the risk that you might emotionally blow. A person who maintains passivity too long not only runs the risk that they're going to allow somebody else to get hurt, or they not only run the risk that they're going to hurt themselves emotionally or physically, but a person who passively holds their negative feelings, their resentments in too long, also runs the risk that they will eventually blow and go into aggressive behaviors. People who hold their feelings in too long sometimes will burst out with yelling and insults and throwing things because they haven't talked about their feelings and processed their feelings with their significant others as time goes by. They let it all out at once, one big blow every once in a while. And of course that carries a backlash at the person who you blow up at. They're going to resent being blown up at. Those resentments might build up again. And we get back to this whole avalanche situation that we were talking about before, where you have two people not handling their emotions well with each other. It gets worse and worse as time goes by. Among equals, boyfriends, girlfriends, spouses, peers, using requests is the only good way in the long run to maintain a good relationship. The use of requests is one of the most difficult things that folks who've come to my office find acceptable. It's hard. It's hard to do that. People who've got habits of being demanding, and they find that with their demands things get done, it's hard to convince them of the value of using requests. Usually the more deeply ingrained a person is in insisting that they have a right to make demands on their spouse or their equals, the more deeply ingrained they are in that, the more unhappy the relationship is in the big picture. People are very ingrained in insisting they have a right to make demands on their husband or wife or their boyfriend or girlfriend or their friends. People who are very insistent on their right to make demands, oftentimes those are folks who find themselves in my office wondering why they don't have good relationships. They feel they don't ask for anything unreasonable, but it's not a question of whether they're asking for something unreasonable. It's a question that they're not asking at all, but that they are demanding. People who make requests, people who are willing to accept no as an answer, usually have much happier relationships. Perhaps they do things themselves more often than they wish, but in the long run it gives a happier, smoother, more respectful, in both directions, relationship with one's spouse or boyfriend or girlfriend or friends or peers. To use good listening skills is also very important in relationships. Using good listening skills, again, is the opposite of being passive aggressive. Using good listening skills means allowing and encouraging other people to tell you how they feel, even if you don't like it. The alternative is passive aggressive. You can either ask people and encourage people to tell you how they feel, or you can shut them out and insult them by not paying attention to how they feel. You'll be causing them emotional harm by insulting them if you don't allow them and encourage them to say what they feel. Using good listening skills is, of course, again, the opposite of the passive aggressive behaviors of refusing to cooperate with somebody in order to hurt them. Using good listening skills is the opposite of that. Good listening skills are a matter of good cooperative conversation, setting up something that can go in both directions. Even if the other person doesn't quite understand what you're doing or why you're doing it, if you use good listening skills, the other person will at least be able to tell you how they feel. Even if they don't understand why you're doing what you're doing, you can understand why they are doing what they're doing. If you have a situation where you make a request to someone and they say no, and then you use good listening skills, you might find out why they're saying no, and you might be perfectly satisfied with their answer. It's less frustrating than just accepting no and walking away. Find out why a person is saying no, not to, in an accusatory manner, ask them, well, why won't you do it? Because that's not good listening skills. To demand that somebody tell you is not good listening skills. But to request, you could ask somebody, would you like to tell me why you don't want to do it? Maybe they'll explain it to you. Maybe you'll be happy with the answer, maybe you won't. But either way, you've used your good listening skills and the other person knows that you cared enough to inquire. Good listening skills and requests can help each other out. They can go hand in hand. In the category of assertive behaviors, there are only 5 types of behavior listed. Only 5. Be calm. Let's try that with a different pen. Be calm. Be polite. Number 2. Number 3 is to say what you feel in a calm and polite manner. Number 4 is to use good listening skills, even if you don't like what the other person is saying. Say what you feel in a calm, polite manner, then help them say what they feel. Not demand that they say what they feel, but to encourage them and perhaps help them to say what they feel. And number 5 is the use of requests instead of demands. Only 5 things. Very, very simple. Now, we are trying to, with this video, seek good ways to cope with emotions, good ways to have communication, and good ways to have relationships. We are seeking the good. In order to seek the good, we had to understand what bad ways were to handle things so that we could seek the opposite of the bad, thereby to find what the good might be. Well, we've defined the good. We no longer really need to focus on what the bad is. We can take all this out. There's no purpose in really trying to memorize and carry around these bad ideas. These don't really need to be up here. If our goal was to join each other in this video so we could learn how to harm people, well, we would have stopped here, here, and here. We wouldn't have written this category. We would have put down the bad. We would have said, okay, now we know how to mess people up. Let's go do it. But the bad simply is not what we're after. We're after the good. By focusing on these 5 good ways of coping with emotions and dealing with communication and relationships. The three bad ways of handling emotions and communication and relationships simply won't occur. The good is the opposite of the bad. They don't coexist at the same time in the same place. If you use the good, the bad doesn't occur. If you just focus on trying to remember what the 5 good ways of handling things are, then you come out way ahead. You don't have to memorize all the multiplicity of bad ways. There's no point in focusing on what the bad is. Focusing simply on the good prevents the bad from occurring. Thank you for joining me for my video today, a video on coping with emotions, communication, and relationships. I hope that you'll find this video helpful and informative. If your problems are severe enough, certainly I would want to encourage you to see a counselor yourself to get some additional ideas and some support. All of the ideas in today's video are based on my past experiences working with thousands of families. It's also based on my education regarding family relationships and coping and so forth. There is no guarantee that any of these skills will work for you, but if you'd like to give them a try, please go ahead. And thank you for joining me today for this part of the Welcome to My Video series. I hope that you have a good day.